This is Change the Narrative, the podcast about innovation in work, life, and culture. I'm your host and tour guide, Michael Hernandez. In this season of the podcast, we've been speaking with authors about writing and publishing nonfiction books. And for this episode, I wanted to speak with someone from my industry, education, about her transition into the consulting world and her use of books through that process. And because that's kind of where my headspace is right now. Now, Starr Sackstein has published something ridiculous, like over 10 books. She's very prolific, and so she must be doing something right. So whether you're an educator or not, I think we have a lot to learn from her. So Starr Sackstein is an innovative educator, author, and speaker dedicated to transforming the learning and teaching landscape. With over 15 years of experience in the classroom, Starr is passionate about empowering students through authentic assessment and personalized learning. As the author of Hacking Assessment and more than 15 other publications, she shares her insights on effective teaching practices and the importance of fostering a growth mindset while downplaying the role of grades. Starr is also a prominent advocate for teacher voice and agency, often engaging in discussions about educational reform and the role of technology in the classroom. In addition to her work as an educator, she hosts the Learner-Centered Spaces podcast with Crystal Fromert, where they explore the intersection of assessment and student engagement. Starr's commitment to continuous improvement and her enthusiasm for education inspires teachers and students alike to push boundaries and embrace innovative approaches to learning. Starr is currently the Massachusetts State Coordinator for Educators Rising, a program committed to developing local, diverse educators, and the COO of Mastery Portfolio, an edtech company working to grow mastery learning in schools and districts. Starr, thank you so much for joining me for this podcast. It's really great to talk with you about authoring books, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to say, especially for first-time authors, but for everyone who's experienced too. So thank you so much.
This is actually the new, can you see behind me?
Yeah.
Those are all my books.
There you go. I was going to ask how you market your books later on, and you just answered that question. So just show up in video podcast, and you can see the books lined up in the background. Exactly. I think I have mine right there too.
You got to make them so people could see it, though.
Yeah, except people can see it. Exactly. You can't block it with your body. Yeah, this is great. So you and I first met, years ago, as journalism educators. We met at a conference and kind of connected that way. I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or more.
At least 10, for sure.
Yeah. And so that's really great that we've been able to kind of continue this and see each other grow in our roles. And you since left the classroom and you're off doing your own thing now, which is really exciting. So maybe we could start things off. Maybe you could tell us, I mean, you've written 14 books by my count, plus additional chapters for other books. Maybe you could tell me why you started your first book and just start there.
Okay. So basically, I was one of those kids when I was in high school. Writing was kind of my thing. And I was like, I always knew I was going to write. Like that was definitely something that was on my agenda for future life. But I think probably about 4 or 5 years into my teaching career, it became pretty evident that like I was learning things that I didn't learn in my program. And I felt like I had some feelings about some of the things that were coming up. So my first book, Teaching Mythology Exposed, was like my attempt at taking like 20 things people say to new people that are just completely wrong. Like, don't smile until December, stupid stuff like that.
And by new people, you mean new teachers?
Yes, new folks. So like thinking about my first 5 years, the greenest time in my life, if you will, in any particular career, and taking what I learned very quickly, worked and didn't work based on what I learned in my grad classes, which I was taking at the same time as I was teaching, because in my undergraduate, I was not, education was not a part of my undergraduate degree. I have a degree in British and American literature and a minor in writing. So like, I wasn't going to be a teacher. I don't know what I was going to do with that pedigree, but it was not teach at the time. And so, like this whole opportunity kind of came when I had noticed some truisms that you sort of hear people saying, and that my experience of those truisms were not true at all. So I was like, all right, I'm going to do some research. I'm going to research the fears of like in-service, pre-service teachers, and I'm going to try to figure out what they're most concerned about. And that's it, it all was this like confluence of I started blogging at that time. I was specifically blogging and using social media as a research tool to really understand the field of early career educators, to really make sure that the book that I was writing was anchored in the truth of more than just myself. So,
Mm.
what like the whole front matter is answers from surveys I was doing at that time, reaching out to pre-service teacher programs and like asking them to share my survey with their teachers, and then using that information. So using that journalism stuff that I learned with, that I was doing with my students, I was crowdsourcing information for my first book. And at that point, I didn't have an editor, I didn't have a publisher. I just had this idea and this desire to write it and publish it. And so I did all those things. I actually hired my own editor at that point so that they could go through and make sure I didn't sound like a complete idiot. There was one project that came before that. It's the only piece of not of fiction I've ever written. And that kind of came out of a project I was doing with students. We were doing a historical fiction unit, and I was modeling the short story that they were writing also. And as I was writing, they're like, Miss Sackstein, you should finish that, turn it into a book. And so I did. I did finish writing that one and self-published that too. So my first two were self-published. And then at a fortuitous moment on social media, I was leading Sat Chat, which used to be a very popular leadership chat on Saturday mornings. And Peter DeWitt happened to be on that chat. He was still a principal at that time. And he really liked the topic, which the topic was about teaching myths and things because it aligned with my book. And he kind of side messaged me and said, I'd love for you to write a post for my blog on Edweek about this topic. So those two things kind of came together. And now I had like this happy marriage of somebody somewhat established giving me a platform to share my ideas after this social media opportunity. And from there, Peter actually offered me my official first book deal. Um, as like I had started blogging for Edweek too after I gave him a blog, and he was instrumental in helping me do that. And then when he got his Connected Educator series with Corwin, he asked me to write blogging for educators, and that was like my first contracted book. So yeah, there's a lot that happened at once, but it was like as soon as I solidified my idea that this is what I wanted to do, opportunities just sort of started to open up.
Wow. Okay, so let me get that timeline right. So you sort of self-published your first book, is that right? Sort of like a
My first two. Yep.
first two. Okay. And the first book was sort of like Kitchen Confidential, sort of like behind the scenes, what you don't really know in the classroom. That's really cool. And then I really like this idea of you connecting with other people, staying, on these Twitter chats at the time, right? That are out there in the world, and just sort of making connections, and then sort of getting inspired to maybe do the next book, or make a connection to connect to an editor or publisher who sees your
Mhm.
work. So being very active on social media, I think is really important. And I've had that same experience with my work too. I'm sort of curious though, you're a very prolific writer. You had a deal with Edweek, which is not a small publishing outfit in the education circle. Um, why write a book? Why not just keep publishing blogs?
So I think both forms, like as a former writing teacher, like I could really appreciate genre choices. And I think that there is something to be said for the short form, which I do enjoy blogging. And as a classroom teacher, I had my own personal blog and I had my Edweek blog. And like reaching audiences, it's the best way to do it now, hands down. Plus, you could target something very small and give it justice. Like, I mean, as somebody who does write as quickly as I do, that's something that I could bang out pretty quickly and has immediate gratification because I could get it out on social. I could get response to that kind of stuff very quickly. But for me, it's more of like in the beginning, it was more a research tool, like what lands and what doesn't land. So I was really testing my voice against what people responded to, what content they responded to. is my own market research, I guess, on some level.
Yeah.
And also getting myself to the point where I was a known entity, because I think if you're going to choose to write a book, not only will it lend expertise to folks who, like, if you have a desire to go into the field as an expert, and I'm using that term so very lightly because it's problematic in a lot of different ways, but like if you're somebody who has a vested interest in a specific topic and you want to share your ideas or your view on those things, it's good to be somebody who's identified with that space, especially if it's a niche kind of space. An assessment sort of is, and that's my space. And being a younger woman up against a lot of really established white guys who are in the space that have been there since a bazillion years at this point. And don't get me wrong, they've all influenced my choices moving forward in a lot of different ways. But I think there's room for different voices and how we handle those things. And I think that as both a journalism and writing teacher, I wanted to live the things I preached in my classes. So that was another thing too, being able to say to students, I write every day. So as a blogger, it's easy for me to say, yeah, this is a habit that I do. I'm telling you to do it. It has helped me become a better writer. It has certainly made it easier for me to write on demand, which is not necessarily a skill everybody has. And if that's something that's going to be of value to you, I would recommend that you start writing every day. And I practice what I preach. If you want to Google me, you're going to see the stuff that I'm writing. I'm not going to put my stuff in front of you because I thought that was like a little vain back then to start putting my stuff in front of my kids. But I'm sure if you Google me, you'll find one or two things worth reading. And I think I like both formats. They're just really different messaging, different mode of communication, different style.
Hmm.
And so because I'm a person who bores easily, I like to mix things up and do a little bit of everything.
Yeah, yeah, I feel you there. So much that you just said is really interesting. So this idea of, first of all, making a name for yourself publicly, having some kind of a track record that not just readers, but publishers can kind of maybe have trust in and go, oh, this
Mhm.
person can complete something. This person has ideas, and here they are. They've been published for a while now. I think
Sure.
that's really important to set that track record up somehow, whatever that industry
And
is.
to that end, too, like publishers look in those spaces. Like if you have a really active blog and a lot of people are reading and back then tweeting, now Blue Sky. I don't know what you even say when you're on a Blue Sky, when you're sending something out.
Yeah.
But when you're microblogging in one of these spaces and you're sharing ideas, and publishers really do take notice of whose work is out there. And I've actually had
Mhm.
at least three different publishers come to me and say, would you want to write a book about, like, my questioning book came directly from an 800-word blog post. They reached out to me and they're like, could you write a book on that? I was like, I don't know that I can write a book on that. And that was 800 words and that was enough. It's not a topic that I generally spend that much time on. And there are certainly more folks qualified out there because they spend their lives doing questions. And I would say that's the book I promote of my own the least because Connie Hamilton's a good friend of mine and her questions book is just phenomenal. So
Wow.
read hers. It's better than
Yeah,
mine.
that's amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
and this idea of like, should I write a book? Am I capable of writing a book? Why me? Why would anybody listen to what I have to say? I
No,
think,
I get
you
those
touched on a
questions a
couple of
lot.
things there, which is coming out of your expertise, your personal experience, what you noticed. That's maybe slightly different take on sort of the standard status quo in your industry. And the idea that, you're talking about you as a young woman at the time, still, how you bring a new sort of perspective to the topic that supposedly has already been done. And I feel like, you were a literature teacher, like every story has already been told, but we keep telling new stories because there's an infinite number of ways that we can sort of riff on or bring something new to the table that hasn't been talked about before. And especially with nonfiction, I think, because the world keeps changing and evolving, whether it's technology or society or business or whatever. Um, And so how we can each bring our own sort of personal take on it, that not everything has been done and not in the way that you would talk about it or address it, I think.
And when folks ask me, because that's the other thing too, if you've been published with a lot of different houses, you're an entity that people know, people feel inclined to direct message you at some point and be like, can I talk to you? Can I run a few things by you? And so a lot of folks over the years have asked, how do I get a book deal? Who's the right publisher to go to? What does that whole experience look like? And I've done a couple of presentations at conferences about it. And I believe that if you have something important to say, if it's important enough for you to spend the time to write it, it's important enough for people to read it. How well you write it is a whole other conversation, but I'm inclined to say there's enough room in the world for another piece of writing from another perspective, especially if your perspective is unique. And the fear of what the process looks like or worry about it not getting published shouldn't be front of mind while you're putting those ideas on the page.
Okay, great. So that leads me to my next series of questions, which is about the
Mhm.
writing process itself. So
Sure.
I know that you are a very fast writer, and I am not. I'm a very slow writer and a slow thinker.
Mhm.
I don't know what that says about me, but that's how it is. And so I'm curious, like on your first book, and maybe it's changed or it's different for every book that you have written. How long did it take from start to finish, and how did you find the time in your busy day as like a mom, as a full-time teacher, to write?
So again, like I said earlier, for me, writing is a habit, and it's a habit I'd always used to try to instill in my students. So I had a vested interest in being visibly at the computer writing in front of my students. And so when I was budgeting time, a lot of it came when my students were doing free writing. I was very much a part of the writing community that was happening in my classroom.
Hmm.
And I was also using my blog as a reflection tool. So if I taught a class that went very wrong, it was an opportunity for me to reflect on where it took the turn and how I could learn from that experience.
Mhm.
So, different kinds of writing, I think, require different levels of commitment. Writing a blog post for me, 500 to 1,000 words is really not that much. And now in the age of AI with ChatGPT, you could probably do it even faster than I could sitting down to do it. I also really didn't put a premium on making sure my posts were perfect. Um, Again, I think one of the real benefits to having a blog is it's your voice, and I think you do yourself and your readers disservice if you polish it too much because it doesn't necessarily represent your voice anymore once you've revised everything out of it. So I wasn't afraid of misspelling words, of not my grammar not being perfect. It was more this activity of sitting down to think and to write through my thinking, and then letting it be raw to, first of all, demonstrate to my students that not all published work needs to be perfect work, which was a message I tried to get to them. Like when you're communicating with an audience, you're building a relationship. And with that relationship, you want them to see your vulnerability and you want them to, I think that there's a lot of currency between teacher and student when you're actively living the things you're asking them to do.
Mhm.
And I think it endeared a lot of my students to me because they knew, first of all, that everything I said was so. I brought in drafts of my books sometimes and editor notes. And if I had a student who really struggled with feedback that I had given them on something they were writing, and I could say from experience, I know it's hard when you work really hard at something and someone gives you challenging, constructive feedback that really forces you to break something that you felt was really good. And that's a tough lesson to learn. And even as somebody who's published as much as I have, it's still hard. Like if I think something's good and then my editor spits it back at me and says, I think we should just take this section out. Um, I wouldn't say that my ego isn't hurt just a little bit when that happens,
Yeah.
but I'm also at a point in my life that after writing as much as I have, I will push back. If it's something that I genuinely feel needs to be in there and my editor just doesn't have the same viewpoint as I do because they haven't lived where I am, I will write back and say, no, I'm not taking that out. And here's why I'm leaving it. And this is like, at the end of the day, your name is the name on the cover. So you need to be happy with the thing that goes out there. So it's like this two-pronged thing, right?
Mhm, mhm.
First of all, it's never going to be perfect. You'll have a chance to do a second edition at some point. So you're going to have to stop yourself. Give yourself the cutoff at some point.
Yeah.
But then the other thing too is since you have the authorial last word, make sure that what goes in writing is really what you want it to say, because at the end of the day, you have editors and they're there to support you, but it's your name on the cover. So you want to make sure that it represents what you want to say and don't allow an editor to bully you into saying something that isn't so.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That sort of sense of authenticity of you, who you are as a person, your expertise in the field, and I'm not afraid to use that word expertise. I feel it's gotten some bad rap lately, but your experience makes you have experience.
Right, you uniquely qualified, we'll say, to do
Uniquely qualified. I
something.
love that.
Yep.
And I also like the idea of like using the writing, maybe blogs, but definitely the book as well, to kind of think through and to iterate. I feel like that's like a key reason to do a book, whether it gets published or not even. Like even if it doesn't get published, like this idea of like working through issues. And yeah, that advice is really good too. I'm a perfectionist, and so I feel like everything has to be line by line, beautiful and polished, and that really held me back. So I like that you have this sense of courage and just like write it, and it's rough and it is what it is, but here we go, right? We can go always
On
go
the
back and
blog,
polish.
yes,
Sorry?
not in my books. Like that, like I mean, like I said, there are different genres of writing, different kinds of writing. I think you could be vulnerable in a book, but obviously it's going to be going through so much more editing and other eyes are going to be on it. And sometimes a turn of phrase that might be something you get attached to will
Mhm.
definitely not make it in because it's just not appropriate.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but
Right.
I agree like that. And what's ironic is that I too am very much a perfectionist, or I was. It's something I actively work on. But for some reason with my writing, it's like the one area where I feel really confident not being perfect.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great. So okay, so I'm curious, like when I started writing my book, I'd written blogs and stuff before. I think you said 500 to 1,000 words is maybe daunting for some new writers who've never written or published much before. Um, but the book was a whole other beast, like managing and wrangling all the content, all the ideas, the research, the case studies. Like a lot of times I got lost. Can you tell me a little bit about your process of like how you
Sure.
organized yourself, either initially with like an outline or as you were working on it? How did you manage all of that?
So I have a process. It's basically how I've written all of my books. I start with an annotated table of contents, right? I have the outline of all the things I want to write and say. I have my subheads, and then I have specific details for those subheads. And I start with that in the table of contents. Now, Google makes it super easy to use different headings, so everything comes up in different places. And then what I do is I copy and paste the table of contents in all of the pieces, and I start doing page breaks to start the chapters, and then I just leave the pieces that are for each of the chapters.
Hmm.
And then I go back to the original table of contents and get rid of all the extra stuff and just leave the the headings of the chapters. And maybe if depending with different publishers do it differently, sometimes they leave the subheads,
Mhm.
sometimes they just keep it bare bones.
Mhm.
And then I take all of that outlined information. And what that really does for me is it gives me the ability to sort of write around things that I'm feeling passionate about at different times. So since all the subheads are in and the specific details under the subheads are in,
Mhm.
if I feel like writing, and this is, in my opinion, one of the great joys of nonfiction writing versus fiction writing, is I can jump around. Like I don't have to worry about a through narrative that's got to make sense. And so I'm writing from beginning to end. It's more like today I feel like discussing grades when I'm writing. So I'm going to go into the chapter that's specifically about grades, and I'm going to talk about the problem because I just came out of a class where I was fighting with a student for 15 minutes about they don't like their grade, and it's in the forefront of my brain. And so I'm going to take the angsty feeling and I'm just going to write it out, in the
Mhm.
problem. And then when we come to some kind of resolution, I might leave the resolution empty. Like I'm thinking about the hack learning series in particular. Like there are subheads that are already in place because you have to kind of follow the template, which is why if you're watching this and you're a first time author, hack learning series, phenomenal first series to be a part of, just because you don't have to worry about an organizing structure because it already exists.
Mm.
It's just about understanding the structure so you know how to fill it in as you go.
Mhm.
And since that very much was one of my first really popular books, that's part of the reason I adopted the write a table of contents, fill everything in, because I was like, that was something that really worked for me.
Mhm.
So it worked for me. I was like, I'll try it in all the other ones. And that's also sort of how I've done my proposals to get new books too. Like
Mhm. Mhm.
you know, annotated table of contents, maybe an introduction so that they could see my full writing if they aren't aware of it at this point. And then, a couple of smaller things along the way. That's another piece of advice I could give your listeners is once you've written one, getting more is a lot easier. Once you've written many, I get to skip a lot of the process with publishers at this point. They know how I write, so it's just a matter of testing the idea, whether or not readers are going to be interested in the idea, just like anybody else would have to.
Mm. Wow, that's great. Yeah, I definitely want to come back to that working with publisher piece in a minute. But it's interesting. So you do a lot of pre-thinking and pre-planning, and have an outline. Did you in advance? And I did that too. I felt the outline was very helpful, to kind of scaffold it and maybe to break it down because it seems so daunting. To say, oh my God, it's like 40,000 words. How am I ever going to write that? Or it's like so many pages. Like, how am I ever going to do that? It's like this monumental, unattainable goal. But if you break it down into, chapters and then sub
Right.
chapters,
Yep.
and I like what you're saying. That's great advice for me. I never thought about like having it all laid out and then like today I'm feeling like I want to talk about this and today this is on my mind or I just read something and I want to address it, in this chapter and you can jump around. I think that's a great workflow. So are you all electronic like Google Docs or do you have like Post-its like all over the wall, sort of organizing your stuff?
I would say both. I definitely do the majority of my writing directly on the computer at this point, just for ease.
Mhm.
But there are times I'm not at the computer where I have an idea, and I'll either like do a Vox note to myself where I'll just say, "Ooh, idea for a blog," or "Oh, this will be really good for this chapter," or whatever, and I'll just make a note of it on the phone while I'm out. I also, I mean, you'll laugh, but like, I mean, I keep a notebook on my desk. Like, I still have like one of these. Um, Even though I have, and I mean, I'm one of these people too who go back through with like little tabs when I need to visit things in there or I highlight things. I do it in different colors. Same with like my I have one of those old school plan books. I have three Google calendars, but I also have a handwritten book like of appointments that sit
Wow.
next to me. Just because I'm such a visual person that just having all of those things kind of helps me understand
Mhm.
where I'm breaking my time up
Mhm.
because I work three different jobs. So like in my handwritten book, everything is color coded. I have highlight stuff that kind of goes on everything. So it's same with the post-its. And that's also how I figure out where there's holes when I'm writing. So I have all these ideas
Mhm.
and I know I want to add research or I want to add someone else's voice to help amplify the point I'm trying to make. It's usually at that point where I'll have people in mind and I'll be like, who'd be really great to tell this story. I'm gonna reach out, and I know that I reached out to you for the last book that I worked on with some friends that'll be coming out in February. Like you could just pinpoint in your brain the right person to illustrate the story that you really want to have, and sometimes it's to an author's benefit to have another voice actually doing that. It's
Hmm.
good for, it's mutually beneficial.
Hmm.
You asking another person to come into your work is going to expand your audience because now that person has a vested interest in helping you sell more books because they are represented in your book
Hmm.
and they shared something that you couldn't have shared on your own.
Hmm.
So, as an English teacher, people reading my work, if I want it to be more global than just a group of humanities teachers who want to focus on assessment in the high school English classroom, I could do that. There are folks who have been very successful. Sarah Zerwin, phenomenal writer, phenomenal books about assessing in the English classroom. But I felt that what I was doing was more global than that, but I didn't have personal experience in a math classroom or a science classroom.
Hmm.
So the best thing for me to do was to tap people that I met online who I knew were doing the work, who had authentic stories to share instead of me creating a hypothetical based on a conversation that I had. It just made more sense to bring another author in to share a story,
Hmm.
which I have done in almost all of my books now. And what I have learned is the more generosity you could feel in the space that you share, the better it suits everyone involved.
Hmm. That's great advice. Yeah, those case studies from real folks not only helps your own writing, but is sort of part of the marketing piece, which is something I
Mhm.
want to talk to you about as well, because it's great that you write a book, but if nobody knows about it, it's like the tree falling in the forest.
Yep.
Like how are you reaching audiences? And so I'm sort of curious, like the marketing, which some people think is like, a bad, cheesy business thing. It's not important to the work, but it actually is because if nobody's going to read your work, then you're not going to have the impact that you hope to have with your
Sure.
writing. And so I'm sort of curious, like the different ways that you have marketed your book, either before you wrote them, during the process, and after. What did you do to share your book and your writing?
So, because I still do quite a lot of crowdsourcing when it comes to writing, because maybe sometimes it's the right person is someone I haven't met yet who has the right story for what I need to share. So people are generally aware of when I'm working on a book because I am sharing things on social media, on LinkedIn, on Blue Sky now, on Facebook, if I think like there are specific targeted groups that would be really helpful. And then once it comes done, like the first big reveal is the cover, I think. Like once you have your cover in hands and you have a release date, um, I say the right time to start marketing is right when Amazon starts doing pre-sales, because it's not going to count right away because it hasn't shipped a book, so the money hasn't gone anywhere yet. But there is a space where people could get excited. I think there is an art to this though, because if you go too early, you lose momentum. And by the time the book actually comes out, people are already burnt out on hearing about it.
Mhm.
If you do it too late, then not enough people hear about it, and you have a lackluster sort of beginning. Some of my publishers have figured this out really well and have like a whole like media kit they give to new folks so that you have the palette of your book, you have the right font scheme. So if you wanted to create a multimedia sort of approach to marketing your work, you could do it so that it looks like your book and everything is branded appropriately.
Mhm.
I'm not saying you have to do that, but the people who I know have done it, like Ali Rodman has done a really great job with her last book. You do a really good job with yours as well. Like you could see the through line of the theme, and my journalism people out there listening, we all understand the power of having, different elements tied together in a way that gets a visual as well as a content sort of pop that is going to get people to want to click.
Mhm.
But so much of that too is like, who do you want to endorse it? And what keywords are you going to use? And what sections are you going to be listed under? And doing research on what books are selling in those sections so that if you could get a new book launch that hits that bestseller for even an hour on Amazon so that you get that little, orange flag under your name, you could take a screenshot of that and that becomes more marketing material. So,
Mhm.
one of the things that I had to get over was this shyness about self-promotion was something that was really hard for me in the beginning. It's still not comfortable completely, but I accept it as a part of the package. And usually when I finish a product, I'm proud of what I've produced. So it's like, at that point, I just want to share what I've written with the world. And in order for me to do that, you can't rely on your publisher anymore because books aren't just marketed through a catalog the way they were 15 years ago, where you have to wait for that publisher to decide whether or not you should even be in the catalog, and then whether or not those paper mailings make it to, people's houses. They still do that, but it's just um they're a lot more choosy. It's not a whole catalog the way it once was. It's like the highlight reel in because it's just too expensive to send that much marketing out in paper these days.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So there's so much in there, and I feel like it's a whole separate podcast episode for how to create the proper Amazon space for your book, which we will explore later. So for those who haven't done a book yet, haven't published, you're talking about multimedia, you're talking about getting your name out. What are some specific things that you did to market your book? Was it just social media posts? Did you go on podcasts to talk about it? Did you have to make graphics and video posts? I mean, what was that like? And at what point did you do that? And what did it change over the course of the publishing process?
I will say this, over the years I've gotten much better. Like I would say in the beginning I was throwing everything at the walls, and I was like back in the day with Twitter where you could schedule everything. So like I would schedule a week out, multiple posts a day. What is this going to look like? I would get in to host as many Twitter chats as I possibly could to reach as many audiences as I possibly could, not just, the loyal group of folks who knew who I was already. Like that was a foregone conclusion that the people who have read my earlier work were likely to buy my newer work, especially if, cultivating those relationships with your readers is really important. I think that that's something that's really different in today's day and age as well as maybe not 20 years ago. Like authors are very accessible to readers now. And I think that you have a responsibility as an author once you make yourself a public entity to be available to your readers. At least that's the tack I have taken.
Mhm.
So I have an email that I have never changed. It is like it started as Ms. Sackstein for my students a bazillion years ago, and it has just stayed the same regardless of me not being in the classroom. My website is Miss Sackstein. All my social media is Miss Sackstein because once that sort of became the brand, I just was like, all right, I'm Starr Sackstein now. I'm not Ms. Sackstein anymore, but that's how people know me. That's how people find me. So it just makes more sense for me to just stay consistent everywhere. And, it's not a bad thing that my humble beginnings started me in a classroom, and that's what I most identify with even still.
Hmm.
And so fortunately, with a name like Starr Sackstein, there aren't many other there. I don't think there are any other Starr Sacksteins in the universe.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
unless the
Unlike me,
multiverse
my name is
comes
very
upon us.
common, so I have to be very clear on that identification. Wow, okay, so marketing sounds like a whole other job.
It is.
What should new authors or, recent authors expect from their publisher? Because I mean, you feel like you sign a contract and they're getting a good chunk of the money for this book. What are they contributing to marketing, and what should we have to do on our own? What should we expect in that?
That is an awesome question. And I will say that every publisher kind of gives a different amount of time to what they're doing. I think in the early stages of writing, this is a conversation you need to raise with your editor. I know that I've become a lot more bold, like I've been bolder in my requests the more time goes on,
Mhm.
rather than be reticent about asking for something. If I have a crazy idea, I go straight to my publisher now, whether it's my direct editor, my production editor, whoever the right person is. Like this morning we actually had a call for the new book with our editor about different marketing ideas. And I like from my last book, making an impact outside the classroom, because it's not a book that is necessarily about keeping teachers in the classroom. like it's not something you're going to market the same way
Mhm.
as a book about assessment where any school, like a leader could buy it, a teacher could buy it, college could buy it for a part of one of their classes. Like there's a lot of different audiences. So I think the first thing you really need to do is brainstorm who your audience, like who are you writing this book for? And then you have your top layer of this is my key audience, but then who else could benefit from reading this, that your secondary audience maybe. And then how you market to those audiences are different. And your publisher is going to be a partner in that experience. They might have a catalog that you become a part of. They might also have connections where they're doing ads for you, like in middle web or through, the district administrator. So whether it's ad space or it's them getting you opportunities to be interviewed, whether it's in writing or in a podcast or opportunities to present at conferences or do book signings, like all of those things you're going to have to be an advocate for yourself. Because as a new person doing this, you are still an untested entity, which means, you're going to have to be the one that says, I could sit on a stage, and I'm saying this for you, Michael, like I could sit on a stage with other people because what I know is as good. And I like seeing you on the stage with, you posted something the other day about, being with people you admire on a stage and like feeling like you had gotten there. I remember the first keynote somebody asked me to do after reading one of my books, and I still had terrible imposter syndrome. Fun fact, still do. Doesn't matter how much you write, how much you know about something, you always feel at some point like you're faking it. So that's another thing you might have to embrace about yourself when all of this starts to happen and people start seeing you as an expert in something you might not actually feel like an expert in just because you wrote about it.
Mhm.
But publishers, unfortunately, are doing less and less to be supportive of you, which means that on your first book, it's like having your first baby. You are going to shout it on the mountaintops about everything, and you're going to be so proud of every milestone, and just be proud of it. No one is going to get sick of you sharing when you do have a milestone moment. So you don't have to worry about people judging you because you're sharing these things.
Yeah.
As somebody who's been doing this a while, I am always impressed by things other people are doing. And I'm not a jealous person. I'm actually more the kind of person that's going to cheer on everybody around me. So, like, when I see awesome things, I make a point of going to that person directly and being like, wow, I saw that post that you did on social. It's amazing. Did your publisher help you with that? Or is that something you cultivated on your own?
Mhm.
I had that conversation with Ali Rodman because I was so impressed with all the stuff she was doing. And
Mhm.
she's like, no, I did it all myself. But on the second book, I knew what to negotiate for on, like, I feel like each time you have this opportunity to press a little further in your contract, get a little more granular in what the expectations are. The first time around, you're just going to be excited you're done. Like, honestly,
Yeah.
like, here's this amazing thing that I created. And it's less about doing all of this stuff than it is about getting it done. But you'll quickly realize, even though you'll promise yourself you're never going to write again, that you find yourself writing again. It's like getting tattoos. It's definitely a thing that just starts to happen where you're like, yeah, I'll do another one because you totally forgot how painstaking it was the first time around.
Or children, maybe.
Yeah, children do. Yeah,
Because they kind of are like children. Wow,
a
that's
little bit.
great. I'm curious, like, what did you discover about yourself through the process of writing, especially the first book?
Um, I'm very tenacious. Like, I'm not a person who quits. So even when hard times came upon me and I might have had ideas and I like might have spent a long time working on something and then I just had to scrap it. I found that I could be really ruthless with my own stuff sometimes if I had to be, and then inconsolable about other things. So like it's this weird like duality almost of like loving and hating everything I write as it's happening, and then bringing in some trusted critical friends. Like that's something I learned about myself. Like, yeah, I could sit down and I could write 10,000 words at a clip and it doesn't like Like my book, Teaching Students to Self-Assess, that little Arias from ASCD, which I think is 12,000 words, I wrote in 2 days. So like, yeah, but that was because, and people might be listening right now and be like, what? I knew exactly what I wanted to say because I was doing that book every day in my classroom. And really what it was an opportunity to codify and share what I was having success with my students.
Mhm.
So it was like, all right, this is what I teach. This is what it looks like. This are some student examples. These are the places like, and it wrote itself. So it does help to know what you want to say before you get started. Um, I will say though that you'll come like there are times where I could sit down during COVID, for example. I was writing Assessing with Respect, and I don't think I realized how the pandemic affected me mentally. There was a lot of fog. I really had a hard time concentrating. So, like, my home space was not a good place for me to write anymore.
Mhm.
And I would try, like, I would open the document every day, stare at the document for a good 20 minutes, decide today's not the day, shut the document, and then just not look at it again. And then as I was about a month till my deadline to submit the manuscript, we were in the height of it all. And we came down to this house in Florida, which was just our second house which was our other place that was out on short-term rental. And we blocked it for 2 weeks, and I wrote the whole thing in 2 weeks while I was down here. The change of scenery really helped. And that's actually something that I've done with multiple books now. Like if I can't write, I'll rent a B and, I'll do an Airbnb for a weekend,
Mhm.
take myself out of my natural setting where all the distractions are and all the things,
Mhm.
and I'll put myself in a place with a good view of a river that doesn't have very many distractions, and I will just sit down and write and not give myself permission to do all the fun things I want to do, like hike or go down to that river or do whatever I want to do with that situation until I write a certain number of words.
Mhm.
So it becomes a discipline thing. And another thing I've learned over the process of these things is that I definitely am a person who's a feast or famine. Like when I'm in the zone, I could kill it. I could get it all done and it'll be done super well with minimal need. If I'm not in the zone and I sit down to write, there is a 90% likelihood of me having to rewrite everything that I put down. So instead of getting nervous about deadlines like I might have 5 years ago, if I'm not in the space to write, I don't. I don't write now. I go do something else that might be inspiring and could get me in that space, but I don't force myself anymore because what I write is usually crap when I force myself and I have to rewrite it anyway. So I just hope for the flow. That's
I'm so glad you said that because you hear all this advice like writing is work and you've got to be there and you got to do it daily and for a certain amount of time and whatever, which I feel there's like credence to that. I did sit down daily and work.
sure,
But yeah, this idea of like you're there or you're not and sort of tapping into that, being in touch with how your body is feeling and where your mind is. In order to do something that's going to be productive rather than unproductive, you have to change it later. So, yeah, I really
sure.
like that. Any other final words of advice for people who are thinking about writing a book but aren't quite sure if they should?
The best way to really make that decision, do a lot of research on what's been written on your topic already. Because your publisher, as you're doing a proposal, is going to ask for that anyway. Who else has written about this? What is there saturation in the market? And if there are a lot of books written, but you're still really passionate, how is your perspective going to be different than all the stuff that's out there? And I think if you can articulate that, you could find a publisher who'd be willing to take you on.
Mhm.
But I might say that maybe you save that for a second book once you are a tested entity, because if you're going to be going into a field where there are tons of known entities on a topic that's been written about extensively, the
Mhm.
likelihood of your voice getting through that is less than if you choose a topic that's a little more evergreen, maybe that you could put your own spin on, especially if you've created teachers out there, if you've created special things you do in your class that only you do with students, that's valuable Think about the practicality of the things you've learned over the years in the classroom that could help new teachers or even older teachers who teach your content area or the grade level that you teach. And your system could be the thing that changes how they think about the thing that's going on in your classroom. So, it really just depends on your own passion about the things that you're writing, and it's how novel it is on some level. And another thing you should be aware of, and I guess this would be the last piece of advice, education books have a very short lifespan. You are not going to get rich writing a book. I am not rich, and I've written 17 that I'm getting paid for or have been paid for a lot. If over the course of a year, through all the publications, I make enough to go on a vacation, that's a good year. And I don't mean like a dinky weekend vacation. I mean like a legitimate vacation. But publishing books, especially education books, is not going to get you rich. So you're not doing this for the money, you're doing it for the passion of whatever you really care about. Or if you're looking to branch off out of the classroom and go on the speaking circuit or the consulting circuit or all those things, which I'm sure we could do 10 more podcasts about all of those things based on the decisions that you make. But just be aware as you're negotiating your contract that you'll likely get a 10% cut the first time around, and it's very hard to negotiate whatever the baseline royalties are on a first untried person. Mm-hmm. But at this point, I usually can negotiate a few points higher than what they're willing to give me on a first pass, because I am tried and tested at this point. Another thing to consider too is that I know that in your questions, Michael, you had asked about things people should know about. I was so excited when I got my first contract. I didn't read any of it. I just signed because I was an idiot. So heed the advice, even though it's a contract and you know most of what it is. There are a few niggly little parts that usually come up in a boilerplate contract that you'll want to negotiate away, like first right of refusal. You don't want to owe your publisher your next idea. I've been in a couple of situations where that has not been pleasant to get out of. So read it. That's my biggest advice. Read your contract before you sign it. It's okay to be excited, but make sure you know what you're signing.
Yeah, that's great advice. Really good advice. Starr, this is amazing. You have a ton of information, and I'm so glad you shared your experience and your expertise with us. I feel even more confident now to write my next book after talking to you, and really excited to see your next book come out in February. So thank you so much for being part of the podcast.
Thanks, Michael.
It's always great speaking with Starr. I hope you found our conversation to be as informational and inspiring as I did. And I particularly liked her ideas around embracing imperfection in our writing, this idea that we can crowdsource and collaborate with other people, and of course, navigating this idea of imposter syndrome that so many of us struggle with, and maybe is one of the reasons why you haven't published your book yet. So really great ideas from Starr as usual. You can find links to Starr's books and her resources in the show notes for this episode. And also don't forget to check out my website, storytellingwithpurpose.com, where I have other resources for writing and links to an upcoming webinar for first-time authors. So until next time, I'm Michael Hernandez.